April 1943. Over the Kuban Peninsula, south of Krasnodar, Ahmet Khan Sultan banks his Yak-9 hard left, cutting inside a Bf-109G that just overshot him. The German pilot pulls up. A mistake, the Yak stays with him. At barely 2,000 meters, the Germans' energy advantage is gone. Two bursts from the Schwerk cannon. The Messerschmitt rolls, trails smoke, and goes in. 6 months ago, this fight would have ended the other way. The aircraft that could make that turn at that speed didn't exist in Soviet squadrons. The Bf-109 pilot would have climbed away, and the Soviet pilot would have died, wondering why his aircraft couldn't follow. This is the story of the Yak-9, the most produced Soviet fighter of the Second World War. Not the fastest, not the most heavily armed, but the aircraft that turned numbers into air superiority and turned air superiority into victory. But in 1941, this aircraft didn't exist yet. The design bureau that would create it was fleeing east on flatbed railcars, and the pilots who would fly it were dying faster than the Soviet Union could train them. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, weapons, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. At 03:15 hours on June 22, 1941, the Luftwaffe launched coordinated strikes against 66 Soviet airfields within 30 kilometers of the border. Aircraft were parked in parade ground rows. Fuel dumps sat unprotected. The first wave destroyed an estimated 1,200 Soviet aircraft on the ground before their pilots reached the flight line. By nightfall, losses exceeded 1,800 machines, 78% destroyed without reaching combat altitude. Within 7 days, the Soviet Air Force acknowledged the loss of over 4,000 aircraft, roughly half its frontline strength in the western military districts. The capability gap made numbers irrelevant. The Iter-16 Type 24, backbone of the VVS with over 1,600 operational, topped out at 470 kilometers per hour. The Bf-109F-2 reached 615, a 145 km per hour gap that no amount of courage could close. The I-153 biplane, still equipping 1,500 positions, faced a 160 km per hour disadvantage and couldn't dive beyond 400. Pilot quality gaps were worse. The average Luftwaffe pilot arriving over Barbarossa carried 200 to 250 flight hours with combat experience from Poland, France, or Britain. VVS replacements reached frontline regiments with 15 to 20 hours total, as few as 4 to 5 on operational types. Entire regiments were functionally destroyed on the first day. Without fighter cover, the consequences on the ground were catastrophic. The Western Front's fuel reserves were destroyed by June 27th, forcing Mechanized Corps to abandon 400 tanks for lack of diesel. Luftwaffe reconnaissance mapped Soviet positions undisturbed. The 3rd and 10th Armies, encircled at Bialystok-Minsk by June 30th, surrendered 290,000 men after Ju-87S demolished the relief columns. Ground commanders faced a strategic void. Maneuver meant exposure. Static defense meant encirclement. Retreat meant annihilation from above. The Red Air Force didn't lose a battle. It lost an air force, and it had to build a new one while the Luftwaffe owned every sky it flew under. The Luftwaffe owned the sky. It would take 2 years, tens of thousands of dead pilots, and over 20,000 destroyed aircraft to change that. The change started with a wooden fighter designed by a man who understood one thing: perfection was the enemy of survival. Through 1941 and 42, the Bf-109 outclimbed, outdove, and outgunned everything the VVS had. Lend-Lease Airacobras and Hurricanes helped, but were not answers. The Terran, ramming attacks were doctrine born of desperation, over 600 documented during the war. Soviet fighter pilots measured their combat careers in single-digit sorties. The Red Air Force needed a fighter that could contest the Bf-109. Not beat it, survive it. Stay airborne long enough to make the Luftwaffe pay for every sortie. Inside OKB-115, Alexander Yakovlev's engineers laid out specifications for a fighter that could be built without aluminum. The Soviet Union's bauxite mines lay under German occupation. The Bureau adopted mixed construction, wooden wing spars and birch plywood skin replacing scarce duralumin. Yakovlev's team calculated load tolerances for a wing that would carry fuel, ammunition, and combat stress across an airframe lighter than anything the VVS currently flew. The engine choice presented no alternatives. Only the Klimov VK-105PF existed in quantity. 1,180 horsepower, a derivative of the French Hispano-Suiza 12Y. It delivered peak output at 800 meters altitude, optimal in the low-altitude air mass where the Eastern Front's ground attack war actually occurred. Not powerful, but available, and matched to the battlefield. The human constraint shaped every control surface. Soviet training programs in 1942 graduated pilots with 40 to 60 hours against Luftwaffe standards exceeding 200. The Yak-9's controls prioritized forgiveness. Stick forces calibrated for teenagers who'd never fired guns in aerial combat. Landing gear designed to prevent ground loops by inexperienced hands. The design brief wasn't build the best fighter in the world. It was build a fighter that a 19-year-old with 40 hours can take into combat and bring home. Above 5,000 meters, the Bf-109G6 was the better aircraft, but 80% of Eastern Front combat happened below 4,000. The Yak-9's loaded weight of 2,870 kilograms against the Messerschmitt's 3,100 translated directly into a tighter turn radius at the lower speeds where novice pilots could stay in the fight. At treetop level, it was marginally faster. On the Eastern Front, treetop level was where you lived or died. The trade-offs were real: lighter armament, one 20mm cannon and one 12.7mm machine gun, wooden constructions, harder to repair, limited range. But Soviet factories could produce 5 Yak-9s in the time it took to build 2 all-metal Messerschmitts. The first reached frontline units in October 1942 near Stalingrad. By war's end, they'd built 16,769 across 11 variants. The Yak-9T with a 37mm cannon for ground attack, the Yak-9D for long-range escort, the Yak-9U with an upgraded engine for late-war engagements. 1 airframe, 11 variants. A platform, not a prototype. On paper, it still couldn't match the 109 above 5,000 meters. But the Eastern Front wasn't fought on paper. It was fought at 2,000 meters in pairs over mud and burning armor. And down there, the math was about to change. By 1943, Soviet pilots received 60 to 80 hours before combat, up from the catastrophic 15 to 20 of 1941, still below Luftwaffe standard. VVS regiments were a mix, veterans with hundreds of sorties flying alongside cadets who'd never seen a 109 outside a recognition chart. They sent boys to fight, men. The boys learned fast, the ones who survived. Among those survivors, Ahmet Khan Sultan, Crimean Tatar, born 1920, factory worker who joined a flying club. In May 1942, he rammed a Ju-88 over Yaroslavl and survived. By April 1943, he was converting to the Yak-9 with the 9th Guards, fewer than 20 hours on type before his first combat sortie. He would end the war a twice-awarded Hero of the Soviet Union with 30 personal kills and 603 sorties. He was 25. The Normandy Niemen Regiment told the other half of the story. Free French volunteers, flying Yak-9s who destroyed 273 German aircraft with kill ratios exceeding 4 to 1. Western trained pilots proving the airframe performed when the pilot variable was removed. Tactics evolved alongside the aircraft. In 1941, solo attacks, no coordination. By 1943, the para-system, leader and wingman, ground-controlled intercept vectoring formations by radio. Flights grew from pairs to 8-ship, 12-ship groups. Individual German superiority met numerical Soviet presence at every altitude. The VVS didn't just get better planes, it learned to fight as an air force. The Kuban bridgehead, spring 1943. For the first time, VVS fighter regiments launched coordinated offensive sweeps. Hundreds of Yak-9s and La-5s directed by ground control to intercept German formations before they reached targets. Over Krimskaya in early May, a representative engagement. A Yak-9 para intercepted Bf-109, G-2S returning from escort. The trailing Messerschmitt broke right. The Yak cut inside, lighter, tighter radius at 300 indicated. The German pulled vertical. At 2,000 meters, the energy advantage evaporated. 2 Schwach bursts. The 109 went down trailing glycol. This was the fight the Yak-9 was designed to win. Between April and June 1943, the Luftwaffe lost 1,100 aircraft over the Kuban. Not a clean Soviet victory. Losses were heavy on both sides, but the first time the Luftwaffe couldn't sweep the sky clean. The cost of air, superiority went up, and Germany couldn't afford the new price. Kursk, July 1943. The VVS mounted 28,000 sorties in 11 days. Yak-9 regiments flew layered sweeps at 3,000 and 5,000 meters ahead of IL-2 formations. The Luftwaffe committed 2,000 aircraft, but the math had no solution. Soviet factories delivered 2,100 fighters that month alone. German production totaled 1,263, split across the Eastern Front, Sicily, and Reich Defense. Soviet replacements exceeded losses by 340 aircraft. German Eastern Front fighter strength dropped by 180 between July and September. At Kursk, the two curves crossed, Soviet production accelerating. Luftwaffe pilot replacement collapsing. The math flipped, and never flipped back. The training crossover sealed it. Luftwaffe schools cut from 210 hours in 1942 to 150 by mid-1943. By October 1944, German graduates arrived at frontline units with 30 to 40 total hours, less than Soviet cadets received in 1943. The Luftwaffe's best were dying, faster than Germany could replace them. The fuel to train them was burning in Allied-bombed refineries. Operation Bagration, June 1944. 7,799 Soviet aircraft against 900 Luftwaffe machines, a ratio of nearly 9-1. German ground forces operated without air cover for the first time since 1941. Berlin, April 1945. 7,500 Soviet aircraft over the final offensive. The Luftwaffe sent handfuls of fighters flown by teenagers. Sporadic, suicidal, statistically irrelevant. The VVS owned the sky through mathematical inevitability. By war's end, the numbers told a story no propaganda could rewrite. 16,769 Yak-9s. The entire Yakovlev family, over 36,000. The Soviets lost thousands and built nearly 17,000 to replace them. Every month after Stalingrad, replacements exceeded losses. The Luftwaffe bled Bf-109s on 3 fronts and couldn't replace losses on any of them. Air superiority didn't just protect Soviet forces, it blinded German reconnaissance. It strangled logistics. It made every offensive from Kursk to Berlin possible. The Yak-9 was the backbone. The airframe always there, in every sector, in sufficient numbers. The VVS lost over 46,000 aircraft during the Great Patriotic War. tens of thousands of aircrew killed. Soviet air superiority was not cheap. It was paid for with pilots who measured their careers in weeks. The Yak-9 was not the best fighter of the Second World War. It wasn't trying to be. Ahmet Khan Sultan survived the war with 30 personal victories and 19 shared kills. He flew 603 combat sorties. He was 25 years old when it ended. Before the war, he was a factory worker who joined a flying club. The Yak-9 was not the best fighter of the war. It couldn't outclimb a 109 at altitude. It couldn't outgun an FW-190. Its wooden wings cracked on hard landings. Its engine was a licensed derivative of a French design from the 1930s. But it could be built by the thousands in factories staffed by teenagers. It could be flown by pilots with 60 hours of training without killing them on landing. It could fight a Bf-109 below 4,000 meters and win often enough to matter. And there were always more of them, month after month, year after year, until the math was the only thing that mattered. In June 1941, the Red Air Force was destroyed. 1,800 aircraft in a single day, an entire generation of pilots killed. 4 years later, the VVS put 7,500 aircraft over Berlin. The Yak-9 was how. The Luftwaffe remained, aircraft for aircraft and pilot for pilot, the finest air force in the world until May 8, 1945. The Red Air Force built something good enough, and built enough of it to blot out the sun. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.